Blackhawks fans, welcome to another edition of the Four Feathers podcast. I am Ron Luce, aka GM Ron. I am joined by our boy Steve today, my friend. This will be a fun show. Today's title, I should say, of the show is a new night at the Roundtable, and we'll get into that and obviously what that means. But Blackhawks coming off a win, a big trade happened. We're going to touch on all of it. But how are you doing, sir? Happy Sunday to you.
Happy Sunday. I'm excited, man. I woke up today, Blackhawks won, and they made a huge trade. So I couldn't be more excited right now, to be honest.
I completely tend to agree. Huge trade. I don't think anybody was expecting said trade the way it happened and occurred, but we're back. We're going to talk all about it. We got some friends already joining us in the comment section. If you want to join along with what we're talking about today, be like our friend Skokes here. Dudes, what's up? He's checking in from over on YouTube. And then our friend UK Blackhawks here. Yes, lads. Yes, indeed. And you can join us from X as well, just as you're seeing here in the comment section. Steve, let's just get into it. Let's not even waste time here, right? We want to get into it. We'll preface everything that's happened, right? The Blackhawks have not come off a good stretch. You and I did not get any points on our record predictions because rather than 1-3 or 1-2-1, the Blackhawks went 0-4 over the 4 games we discussed. Ugly loss in Utah. We heard the comments from Seth Jones after that game and everything that transpired with that loss. They go to Vegas. They get absolutely trounced, even though the Hawks made it interesting later in the game. But it really never felt they were in it. They were always just chasing from behind. And then the weekend comes. Yep. And all of a sudden they win a game against Anaheim. An awesome game. 6-3 win. The defenseman who played in that game, because Seth Jones did not, for good reason, as we're going to discuss, the defensemen were involved in 5 of the 6 goals for the Blackhawks against Anaheim.
Yeah.
Alec Martinez had 2 assists. Kaiser had the opening goal, which was a beauty as he snuck down from the point to rip a shot. And then, of course, Vlasic had 1 assist. And then Brody even had 1 assist, even though he only played 10 minutes of ice time because it was pretty much just 5 defensemen playing there for the Blackhawks. It was that kind of game. They got things going. That leads them to where they are now. 18-35-7 is the record. Ryan Donato still leads the team in goals. He's now up to 21 after 2 goals in that game against Anaheim. Connor Bedard still leading in assists and points, but maybe not for long. Maybe not for long because Teuvo Teravainen's on a hot streak. He's up to 46 points now. He's trailing Bedard by 3 and trailing Bedard by only 1 assist for a share of the team lead with at 33 assists. He's got 32. Donato with 43 points as well. So now 3 Blackhawks players with over 40 points on the season. We still have not seen Laurent Brossoit, and we're going to be able to work that into some of our discussion today. But Steve, we finally made it to the fun part. I think what we actually want to talk about today. Stuart Smith says it here. Spencer-Knight, baby. Good riddance, Seth Jones. Regardless whether it's good for the Panthers, it's amazing for the Hawks. The trade that happened. Seth Jones goes to the Florida Panthers. Blackhawks retain $2.5 million a season of his contract, so he's gonna hit Florida's books at $7 million a year. Obviously, in a few years, that contract's going to look great because the cap is going to go up exponentially over the next 3 seasons. Jones is going with a 4th-round pick, so the Panthers are getting a pick in 2026 from the Blackhawks. It's a 4th-rounder. In return, the Blackhawks are getting the 2026 first-round pick, and there's a little asterisk next to that for Florida because the Blackhawks have essentially given the Panthers the ability to still trade their 2026 first at this year's deadline, potentially, to make another cup run because that pick can slide to 27 if it gets used in another trade. So Kyle Davidson being like, hey, you guys are helping us, we're helping you. But we can slide that pick to 27. Totally cool, totally fine, no problem at all. There's a very good chance that pick's not even going to get used on an actual draft prospect for the Blackhawks. I think it's going to get traded, in my personal opinion. And then obviously Spencer-Knight is the biggest addition. The young Florida goaltender, he was a first-round pick in 2019. According to Kyle Davidson, the Blackhawks were very interested in Spencer-Knight entering that draft cycle. Of course, they got very lucky with how the ping pong balls bounced, and they ultimately took Kirby Dach number 3 overall in that draft, rather than probably getting Spencer-Knight right around where they normally would have picked around like 12, 13 in that draft. I'm done talking. Enough of me talking. Steve, how'd you feel when the trade came through? We've had a little under 24 hours now to kind of stew it over and really think about it. Your thoughts
Yeah.
on Seth Jones moving on and a big addition now for the Blackhawks as well?
Yeah. So I found out after being on the road all day. I came home, saw my phone blowing up. And that's kind of when I knew something big had happened, but I had no idea I was going to see Seth Jones traded. That was huge. Um, and I think for me, it rebuilt some faith that I was kind of maybe wavering on a little bit with Kyle Davidson, just
Okay.
because I was wanting him to make a big trade that would, not just get draft picks or draft capital, but bring in some young players. And I honestly wouldn't have even thought of thinking about Spencer Knight. So that like seeing that as a return is huge. Um, and like it's great for the team. He opens up a ton of cap space flexibility. We get a potential franchise goaltender that's probably on like way high ceiling, but he's going to be a solid goaltender. And then we still get a first round draft pick, which kind of like what you were saying, Ron. You don't have to use it to draft a player. That's a pretty solid trade piece that he could use. So and then
Indeed.
on top of all of that, um, he retained only 2.5 million on Seth Jones' contract. I think before the trade happened, a lot of people were saying like, um, he if he's going to trade before the deadline, you could probably expect retaining 50% on Seth Jones' giant $9.5 million contract.
Hmm.
So to see that he's retaining technically 26%, that's huge. So now we got a ton of cap space, um, and I think on all fronts this is a huge win for Kyle Davidson.
Definitely. It really is a huge win because you and I were talking about it a little bit before we jumped on the mics on live here with the Four Feathers show. They have nobody under contract effectively after next season. It's obviously they'll re-sign guys like Bedard and Nazar. We know that. But like as of what's signed right now, there are 4 players under contract entering the 2026-27 season. Tyler Bertuzzi, Teuvo Teravainen, Alex Vlasic, and Landon Slaggert. That's it. All the flexibility in the world. And sure, that 2.5 is going to be carried for the Blackhawks in terms of retained money. But guess what? Rantanen's money that was retained is coming off the books. This is the last year of Jake McCabe's money that they've been retaining on for the last handful of seasons with the Toronto trade back in the day. And the buyout dollars that they accepted effectively just to help out the Islanders for Josh Bailey also fall off the books. So there's another 7-something million dollars coming off in terms of just retained and dead money that the Blackhawks have. Not to mention even Andreas Athanasiou's contract expiring at the end of the season, unless he's magically traded at the deadline, which I don't see happening. There's a lot of moving pieces, but this is the offseason, right? It's a good free agency class. Maybe not great, but good. They can make a lot of things happen. They can move a lot. I think it's going to be the craziest summer of trades we've seen because of where the cap is going. So with all that in mind, again, like you said, you can move that first, now that they've acquired and get some help for guys like Bedard and Nazar. And as our friend Stewart says here too, hell, you could even move that Toronto first that you have this year as well, because the Hawks first is going to still be probably in the top 4 picks. And then you can go ahead and also still move that Florida piece. Like you have 2 first-round picks that are essentially free change to move at this point in a deal for, like you said, maybe it's a young player that they're bringing in to kind of help find his piece in the foundation, or maybe it's just a veteran who's established that maybe can help take some of these guys over the top. And obviously, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, right? Like the trade deadline is coming, so obviously we'll focus more so on trades. But the summer is going to be unbelievable when the time rolls around. Steve, I do have a question for you here while we're on the topic of these 2 first-round picks. Do you think Kyle Davidson turns around and uses one of these picks at the deadline to maybe get somebody before Friday comes and goes?
My personal take on that is, actually, because like originally I want to say like he's not going to add a veteran, just because you want to keep some space open for some of the younger guys. But I mean, at this point where you're looking at the roster and Bedard, is struggling to generate offense on the top line. He might be able to find somebody that could play with Connor Bedard. I don't know who that player would be, Ron, but I think now that he has a potential trade chip, he could definitely get a veteran that has a lot of skill that would provide offense. Because I think Connor Bedard right now, he's number one focus of getting him developed, getting him good offensive zone time. But his scoring has been quiet in the past 5 games. He doesn't have any points, and I think it's a priority to get Connor Bedard some help. So I'm not going to write it out. I could see somebody getting traded onto the Blackhawks.
Indeed. I think it's going to happen because there was a report that came out, it feels like months ago, but it probably was only a handful of weeks ago at this point, that they are exploring the idea of adding a veteran at the deadline. And it's a guy who's going to be under contract at least for next season, somebody who's going to be able to come in. I know a big name that was out there was Anders Lee with the Islanders as a potential fit. He's got one more year. I believe his cap hits about $7 million for next year. But his actual salary is only about 4.5. So that's why a lot of people think he's a key candidate that could come in there. There's a couple other names. Michael Bunting was a name that was thrown around at that time too. So there are options out there, right? There's going to be teams that are truly full-blown sellers. And I think the Blackhawks will be soft sellers in some capacity by Friday. I think we could see Ryan Donato moved out. I do think we could see some of the other veterans, like guys like Pat Maroon and Craig Smith, who, maybe team wants to give up a sixth or a prospect that needs to change a scenery or something for a veteran. If they're on a cup run, I think that's totally possible. Not saying for sure it's going to happen, but I think it's totally possible. I really do think, though, they are going to try and add while subtracting potentially at the deadline this week. Again, there's a lot that's going to happen in the next really 5 days of us recording the show here on Sunday. That's going to make it really, really fun to see. And as Kevin Patterson says here, we need help at center. I agree with that. I actually have a little bit of a tinfoil hat take. I'll share it a little bit later when we're ready to ruffle some feathers about what could happen at center in the future. But some fun ones here. Tamina too saying pretty sure we'll have Rantanen on our payroll for next year with a little bit of a winky face. In addition to that, Kevin said the players showed what they thought of the trade with their play against the Ducks. And 0944 here saying, well, he was at the game last night. Honestly, he believes the Ducks played better despite the loss. And I think that's the other angle that I wanted to take with this, Steve, that I wanted to talk to you about was what the departure of Seth Jones does to the locker room. Because despite him being a leader, and Lucas Reichel had glowing remarks for him and things like that, I think as a player and as a guy in that locker room, he wasn't a cancer in the sense of he's just not a good person. But I think him being very open about, hey, I kind of got screwed over by Stan Bowman and company, telling me one thing, signing a huge contract, and it being completely different in his tenure with the Blackhawks. I think that just became a distraction for the team over the last couple of weeks, really, especially coming out of that Four Nations break, because that kind of broke right before the Four Nations face-off break. And then it really accelerated afterward in terms of him, discussing that, the reports of his agent and the Hawks discussing a trade and all of that. So I think it did become a little bit of a distraction for the room over the last handful of games. I think we really saw it, especially in that Utah game and especially in that Vegas game. I think that's where we really saw it the most. Despite the losses, Columbus, you could, chalk up to they weren't ready to play after 2 weeks off. And then they didn't play horribly against Toronto at home, but again, they still could have probably played better. I think, White Sox Premium says here, he's like, Jones being gone is like taking the anchor off the leg you've been dragging. I think not necessarily because, he was a bad player and a bad guy for the room. I don't think he's that kind of guy. It was a bad situation. And once his thoughts became very public and vocal, I think it became a distraction. And now that that's gone, I think these guys are just going to play the rest of the season very freely because now there's no expectation. You're not going anywhere in terms of playoffs. And you really are thinking about the future. And now the spotlight is going to be on these young guys, whether it's on the blue line or whether it's, guys like Frank Nazar and Connor Bedard and now even Spencer Knight and Crease, who are really going to take the focus of the team now for the rest of the year and, be what we as fans tune in to see because we want to see how these guys finish out the year before what should be a very exciting summer. Do you agree with that? Do you think that this team looked just played freely against the Ducks. I know they've had a lot of success against the Ducks, and it's a team that they've historically played well, but it feels like there was something to be said for how they responded after the Seth Jones trade happened.
Yeah, first off, Zero, you said you were at the game yesterday. Super jealous. I almost went to that game, but yeah,
It would have
I'm
been a
kind
good
of jealous
one.
of you, man. Yeah, but this was something I noticed when Jones was injured earlier in the season before the Winter Classic. Was that when we had Kevin Korchinski on the team, the Blackhawks defense looked pretty solid offensively. Kevin Korchinski looked like he was having fun, and the team looked better overall. Now, when Jones came back, we all know he had like that rough comeback and that one really bad game. I think it was against the Flames, but
Yeah,
either way, it was like a switch had flipped. Um, Me personally, I've always thought that Jones was a good defenseman. I'm not going to say that like I'm not like a Seth Jones apologist or whatever, but like he was a good defenseman. So I assumed like him being back with the team was going to improve the team's defense. But then yesterday, it was very reminiscent of when he was away from the team before the Winter Classic, where yesterday the defense looked really good. Wyatt Kaiser, in his first game back from the AHL, scored a really nice goal. And Ethan Del Mastro, who's kind of really exceeding my expectations, and I was kind of high on him to begin with. Um, he looked like he was doing pretty solid. Still a little bit of mistakes, but that's fine. He's young.
sure.
So now I'm kind of wondering, kind of like what you were saying, Ron, where just that vibe was maybe doing something to the locker room, and that's speculation on my part. I'm not in the locker room, but
Sure.
it's something that could have probably impacted not just their well, I guess their play on ice, but like their attitude, um, just like a negative kind of drag just going on, um, because they look different. They do, and
Mhm.
it's sucks for it to say it, but like good luck in Florida. I'm happy to see the young kids kind of get this opportunity.
I agree. I think you laid it out perfectly. And that's something that I've been thinking about probably over the last 24 hours or so now is just the situational setup of everything, too, right? Because in the case of a guy like Seth Jones, it was him and he was like, Master Shredder to the baby Ninja Turtles, essentially on the blue line, right? Like he's the kind of the vet, right? I know Connor Murphy, you could kind of categorize as that too, but then it's all the young kids. It's Vlasic, it's Del Mastro, it's Kaiser, it's the cup of coffee that we saw for Korchinski. Like that's kind of what it's been. Now it's almost like those young guys can play more freely because there's less of that like, well, we need to be perfect and we need to do this. And it's like, no, like just go play your game, get better, become the best version of yourself, and then we can worry about that. Again, this really, I think, came down to I think Seth Jones is still a really good hockey player. I know a lot of people disagree with me, but Seth Jones is still a really good defenseman. I think he's going to do a really, really well in Florida. To me, that was Florida or Dallas were the best two landing spots, in my opinion, for Seth Jones. So for him to get down to Florida, because now you look at for Florida's case, right? Florida had a great blue line last year because a lot of guys came out of nowhere and became top-notch players. Brandon Montour, obviously, he had a few-year run there where he really came into his own. Oliver Ekman-Larsson had an incredible bounce back in his time in Florida that landed him a really nice contract in Toronto last summer. They miss those guys now because Montour's in Seattle and Ekman-Larsson's in Toronto. Now with the Nikola, of the world, and obviously Aaron Ekblad and Gustav Forsling are still the top dogs there. Those guys are all established. They have an established defensive group where I think Seth Jones is going to slide in perfectly. He's going to get power play time as well. That team is humming on a different level. He's not going to have to play hero from the blue line like he was at times, it felt like, in Chicago. Now he can just be a part of that system, fit where he's going to fit, and help them generate further offense from the blue line. I think it's going to be a good fit all the way around for everybody involved. He gets to go be competitive with a team that is absolutely competing for cups for the next 5 years that he's under contract. And the Blackhawks get exactly what they need, a young stud goaltender, a guy who, I think people aren't really like, Blackhawks fans, I think, understood how good Spencer Knight is. But for anybody that wants to go explore the social interwebs of X and all these social platforms, go see what the Florida Panthers fans are saying about Spencer Knight. I've seen multiple Florida Panthers fans say like he's going to deliver Chicago a cup and he's the best guy around and we're so going to miss him. And like that speaks volumes when a fan base is upset that they lost this guy, even though they're excited about what Seth Jones brings to the table as a part of their new look blue line. So I really think it's going to be huge. And Stewart nailed exactly what he said it a little bit earlier, what you were saying, Steve, too, right? They looked better when he was injured. And then it felt that way again when the time came. I think again, it's not necessarily he's a bad player, just the fit wasn't right and the timing was bad. And I think a lot of wrongs were righted by the trade that happened on Saturday. I think for both the franchise, the player, I think everybody involved got what they wanted. And I think this is probably one of the few trades where everybody can kind of look at it and say, wow, kind of both sides came away with good value here. And I think everybody's happy and nobody's pissed. And there's no one-sidedness to this deal because at the end of the day, everybody is going to get involved. Hello, Tim. It is good to see you. We're getting a lot of comments. Daniel Barry, what's up? But Tim had a good question earlier from his X account too. And this is kind of where I wanted to take one more question here before we got to give Spencer Knight a little bit of love here. But who do you move out now? Is it Mrazek? Is it Soderblom? Is it Brossoit? If he's a real person. Brossoit is a real person. He's just been hurt. So it'd be interesting. I think there's a world where the Hawks carry 3 goaltenders the rest of the season. I think that is a very, very real possibility. But I do believe that they are going to probably try their hardest to move Mrazek at the deadline now. And we've seen how well Soderblom has played this season. I think he's earned himself another contract, which, hey, him and Spencer Knight being your 1-2 as 2 really young goaltenders with a lot of promise is awesome. I think that's best case scenario for the Blackhawks right now. But I really do believe they're going to try to move Mrazek before it's all said and done come Friday. That being said, we got to give Spencer Knight some love, right?
Yeah.
This guy has had a really good season. I know a lot of people probably don't follow Florida Panthers hockey, so we're just going to give you the 4-1-1 here. So Spencer Knight's had 4 seasons of NHL action. He only played 4 games in his first season. It was coming out of it was that really crazy shortened season after COVID. He was 4-0 in those 4 games, even though he only made 3 of the starts, but he got credit for the win in one of them. Had a 232 goals against, 919 save percentage. Awesome, but only played 206 minutes of action. Then in 2021-22, he struggled a little bit, but still had really good numbers. He was 19-9 with 3 overtime losses, 32 games played, 27 starts, 279 goals against average, and 908 save percentage. Then 2022-23, which was the last time we saw him in the NHL before he took his leave of absence and took care of himself and got himself in the right state of mind. He was 9-8 in 21 games played with 3 OT losses as well, made 19 starts. He had 318 goals against, but still a 901 save percentage and a shutout in that season. So again, he took his time away, stepped back, spent in the entirety then of his return in Charlotte as a part of the Checkers as their number 1 goalie. Of course, he joined the team as the kind of the 3rd goalie in that Stanley Cup run and was a part of the team during that time. But he's had a really good start to this season. 23 games played, 21 of those being starts. 12-8-1 with a 240 goals against, 2 shutouts, and a 907 save percentage. Like even in limited action in Florida, and of course he's playing behind a good team, and that always helps too, right, for the goalie's numbers. But he's been really, really good behind Bob's this year and looks like the guy that everybody expected him to be coming out of the draft when he did back in 2019. He's only 23 years old, Steve. Yeah. I am so excited to see Spencer Knight in a Blackhawks uniform because this is the guy that, like, my buddies and I listened to the 32 Thoughts podcast today while I was lifting weights, and somebody gave shit to Elliot Friedman for his last show about Carlson going to Dallas. He's like, it's like you're playing a video game with your trade suggestions, right? This is something I talk about with like my good buddy Aiden, who's a big hockey fan, and some other people that I know that like, wouldn't it be cool if the Hawks like traded for Spencer Knight like it was a video game? And it feels like that's kind of what's happened because you would have thought that a 23-year-old goalie with tangible NHL success would never be available. Never. And he was.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And what a good get for the Blackhawks because And good for Spencer Knight. He finally gets the chance to be a number one goalie. He's not living in the shadow of a future Hall of Famer in Sergei Bobrovsky. And like, this is your team. You get to grow up with these guys. Like, you're young too. You get to be a part of this nucleus with Bedard and with Nazar and with Korchinski and Levshinov when they eventually come. Like, I would imagine like that Knight's got to be pretty excited. And like, and Skoke says here, like him and Soderblom should be the tandem moving forward. You got two young guys who the ceiling is, who knows? This could be exactly what the Hawks need. It could address probably one of the biggest. We have a lot of friends of the program that come along with us and comment. Last time you and I were on a show, Steve, we were getting goalie concern questions in the comments because of Brossoit's injury and Mrazek's play. The Spencer Knight trade has largely taken care of those concerns, I think. And this guy's going to have every opportunity to seize that crease as his own here in Chicago. Like, I'm finally taking the time now, Steve, now that we're talking about it, to get excited. I can feel my blood pressure raising right now because I'm excited. Like, holy shit, Spencer Knight is a Chicago Blackhawk. How awesome is this? Like, this dude felt like a fairy tale of an option ever for the Blackhawks, let alone getting moved out of Florida. To get him for Seth Jones, which like you kind of help everybody involved. Masterclass from Kyle Davidson. Absolutely unbelievable. But I'm so excited to see Spencer Knight in the Blackhawks union.
Oh yeah, me too, man. And I was kind of thinking about how earlier in the offseason, I'm going to butcher his name, was Askarov, that goalie from Nashville.
Yaroslav
really
Askarov.
Yep. Mm-hmm. San Jose went and made a trade and got him. And I was a little kind of bummed out. I was like, man, that would have been a cool trade to see Kyle Davidson make. I didn't hold it against him, but still, I was like, that's kind of what I want to see. So now that we get Spencer Knight, I'm excited. I'm pumped. He's going to be a solid goaltender, and that's something that this organization needed because Soderblom, he's looked great this year. Fantastic. We don't really know if he'll be the starter, but at very minimum, like he's looking like he can be a solid backup. But then in our pipeline, you got Drew Comesso, who's kind of going to need some time to develop in Rockford. So now this lets him breathe and develop down there, and you don't got to rush him to the NHL, especially with goaltenders who are weird and you don't know how they're going to turn out. And then we also have Adam Guyan over in Minnesota in his freshman year, and he's looking like he's going to need some time to develop because he hasn't been having the best season. So this is a huge win. It provides a lot of life and longevity to the Blackhawks goalie prospect pipeline. So this was huge, like you said, on every single level. This is a big thing for the Blackhawks.
It really is. I love what you said there. I think that was poetically put. It adds just a shot of youth and longevity into the goalie pipeline because really think about it. Every single goalie on the roster or in the organization that's not named Peter Mrazek or Laurent Brossoit, who for all we know might not even be here at the start of next season, depending on how things go between now and really the end of the summer. They're all 23 and younger. I mean, this is an infant group in terms of goaltending pipeline, which is it's kind of perfect, right? Because these guys are all going to grow with this Blackhawks roster that should grow into hopefully a playoff team in the next 2 to 3 years, right? So maybe, just maybe, when this team is truly competing for titles, Knight's going to be in the prime of his life. Soderblom might be in the prime of his life. Comesso might become a draft pick or a trade chip at some point, right? If things go really well. And then Adam Guyan, who is much younger, he's only, 19? He can take 5 years to develop and then maybe be the backup of the future behind a Knight or, because best case scenario for the Blackhawks, Soderblom outplays his contract in Chicago and somebody wants to pay him starter money and Spencer Knight's your number one and you go, we love you, Arvid, but we can't pay you, but go be great. Like, go do your thing. Kind of what the Blackhawks in effect, obviously it's not apples to apples, so don't burn me at the stake here, people. But like what happened with Niemi, right? Niemi came up, had a fantastic rookie season, Him and Cristobal Huey shared the net. It all looked great. Everybody was all, yes, Nieme is the goalie of the future. And then the Sharks went, no, we're going to overpay Hjalmarsson, which in the end of the day was not an overpay, but we're going to give Hjalmarsson big money on an offer sheet. You got to pick. Are you to keep in Hjalmarsson or are you keeping Nieme? And obviously the Hawks made the right decision in the long run, but then Nieme leaves, Corey Crawford comes up and becomes one of the greatest goaltenders in team history because you had that pipeline there. Now they have that opportunity. It's not just Soderblom and the what ifs of Drew Comesso and Adam Guyon. Now you have an established young piece who, again, I love the longevity word because I think that describes it perfectly for what this goalie pipeline looks like. And again, you do still have veterans here. Laurent Brossoit has played really well. He just has had a really freak injured season this year that he really hasn't had before. And then, of course, we all know what Peter Mrazek is at this point in his career, and that's neither here nor there, whether he's here with the Blackhawks this season or not. He's been around, right? Like he's going to be good for some of these young guys probably too, even if it's in a limited amount of time as the guy. This trade is awesome. And honestly, Steve, I think it's just the start of how this week is going to go. I really do. I think this deadline is going to be crazier than any other because of the salary cap information that was released a few weeks ago. That to me has just set the next 4 months to become the craziest nonsense we've seen in terms of movement in the NHL. I really do. Because now teams look at it and all of a sudden every team that was cap strapped goes, all of a sudden we aren't so cap strapped anymore. Because in 2 years, we're going to have an additional, $20 million to screw around with? I mean, that's a lot of money bumping up, right? It's going to be 95 this year, which is already a $7 million increase from the past season. That's one really good player for most teams. And then it's going to go up another 7. And then it's going to be like 113 in 3 years. And that's just an estimate, right? If things keep progressing and, hockey, all of a sudden the Four Nations face-off has made it a more popular sport. And the Olympics next year might be the greatest thing for it. You put these guys on display again playing for their countries. And maybe in 2 seasons when they think it's going to be 113, maybe it's 116 or 117. All of a sudden, all these teams have money to spend, even the contenders. I think shit's going to get really, really weird between now and Friday. And then everybody's going to take a quick time out and go play in the playoffs and go do your thing and go try to win Lord Stanley's Cup. And then the draft's going to come and everybody's going to be like, come on, frenzy, let's do it all over again. It was so much fun. I think that's what's going to happen. And I think it's going to be awesome. I agree with Brian here in the comments. He says, I don't think the Hawks are done. And he asked if we think they're going to keep that pick or move it. I think they're going to trade it. I really do. And I think it could happen as soon as Friday. I think this is the first deadline. And Steve, I want to know if you agree or if you disagree with me. To me, this is the first deadline to the Kyle Davidson era where now it really feels like hey, you can do a soft sell, right? You can see what the Donato market is. You can see what maybe the market is for a Pat Maroon or a Craig Smith, which probably isn't a whole lot. If you really feel like Lucas Reichel needs a change of scenery, do you dangle him and just see what happens? Are you able to move Peter Mrazek to a team that maybe had a lot of goalie injuries or something like that? But this is the year, if any, where you can also at the same time go, no, but we're going to buy on somebody. Maybe not huge. We're not going out and trying to get Bowen Byram for Casey Middlestat like we saw last year at the deadline. But maybe we get that Anders Lee trade or something along that kind of equivalent line. Maybe they go trade for a guy who's an impending free agent that they wanted to sign in free agency. You get him in the building now and you go, we can give you the 8th year if you want it. I think weird things are going to happen before Friday. To me, again, this is the deadline, if any, that Kyle Davidson can finally get a little aggressive. And it's not just about accumulating assets for the future in terms of draft capital.
Yeah, I agree. And, last year, I think last year's trade deadline was kind of a letdown. I don't even remember what trades we made. The potential pieces like Dickinson, Foligno, Mrazek, they were all signed. And then the last, I don't even want to say exciting, but bigger deadline was when there were rumors about Patrick Kane. That's kind of a dark period of time for me, so I don't like thinking about that week. But this year, it's suddenly it's going to be an exciting deadline for Blackhawks fans. I wouldn't expect something huge to necessarily 100% happen. I don't want to get people's hopes up. But like Donato has been doing really good, and I would rather keep him, but he's probably going to get traded. And that first round pick that we got, we could use that this year, or we could save it to trade later. So it's going to be a very exciting week. I can't wait to just have my phone going off and just freaking out about all these crazy trades going through. It's going to be a good time.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, there's going to be a lot to think about here. Stuart said this a little bit earlier, mentioned if Nashville got that return, Donato's going to get a haul. And that was in the Askarov trade. Like, they got a lot for him, even though it was very clear he didn't want to be there anymore. Goes to San Jose. San Jose gave up quite a bit to get him. A first, couple of prospects. I mean, there was some big things involved. I think there's a chance that Donato gets a ton at this deadline from somebody. Like, I think there's a bidding war that happens, and especially a team. Again, a great thought from Elliot Friedman, who's so obviously tapped into the NHL and these markets and contracts. Mentioned like a team like Winnipeg, for example, right? A lot of guys that have modified no trades, Winnipeg's on their no trade list because there's not a lot to do in the city of Winnipeg. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's a smaller NHL market, even though they've obviously got a crazy passionate fan base and they have a really good team this year. A guy like Ryan Donato for them is probably one of the top guys they can target at the deadline because he has no built-in blockers in his contract that would keep him from going to Winnipeg. And we've seen the Hawks and Winnipeg make trades before. Like, Kevin Cheveldayoff is no stranger. He was a Blackhawks front office member for God's sake at one point in time. Like, they've been very open to making deals with the Jets and the Hawks have. So maybe Donato's a candidate for them to get better at the deadline. You can make the same argument for just about anybody. Colorado Avalanche, who don't have a ton of cap space to play with. He's only $2 million. Like, he's the easiest guy to probably acquire at this deadline too, because he's not a big contract either. Prorated right now, he's only due another like $750K probably for the rest of the season, if that. I mean, it's next to nothing. He's not going to cost teams in terms of physical dollars against the cap a whole lot. That might, especially if there's any level of a bidding war, that's going to do some things. And this is, I believe, what the Nashville trade was. I hadn't seen this yet. I saw the rumors of it. I didn't know it had officially happened. Gustav Nyquist going for a second-round pick. And Gustav's not having nearly the season Donato is. I think there's a world. The problem I have, though, Steve, with getting a first in this year's draft, this is not a super deep draft class. It almost feels like getting a future one is the way to go if you're going to get a draft pick. Or honestly, I'd rather, if I'm the Blackhawks, if there's a team that you're making a trade with that has a top prospect that's close that you're interested in, I'd almost rather do a 1-for-1 swap in that nature if you're going to do something like that. Get a guy that's a little more established and you kind of know what it is already, and maybe give him a chance in the NHL the rest of the season type thing. I think that's kind of where I go, but yeah, to see Gustav Nyquist go for a 2 is... Kyle Davis should have a long line at his door for Ryan Donato over the next 4 or 5 days.
Yeah. It kind of set the market for Donato. So it'll be interesting to see what happens now.
They really will. They really will. And I think that's the beauty of the NHL trade deadline is, although there is still a lot of action on the actual day of the deadline, there's going to be a lot of things happening between today as we record on Sunday. Obviously, the Nyquist trade has already happened. And, really Thursday night even. I think there's going to be a ton of movement over the next 4 or 5 days in the NHL. So I'm sure the Blackhawks are going to be involved in it in some capacity. To what extent, I don't think we know yet. I don't know if it's going to be the same level of a trade deadline as it was 2 years ago when Kane was moved, where they made a lot of little trades too. They went out and got, there was rumors it was going to be, Adam Turcotte at one point, and then it ended up becoming something else. And there was a lot of those little trades that happened. I don't know if they're necessarily going to be the same this year, but I do believe the Hawks are going to be involved in at least. I'm going to set the line at over under 2.5. And I would probably take the over in terms of moves made between now and Friday that the Hawks are somehow involved in. It might even just be to help broker cap dollars, right? But I think there's a world where, they could potentially do that. I know they don't have any more retention spots, but, if they're able to take on a bad contract or something in a player that helps facilitate another trade, I think there's a lot of possibility there that things could go. Tim says Nyquist is a more proven scorer. He had a 75-point season before. Sure, but that was also when he was also still a top 6 forward. He really hasn't been that in a while. I mean, he's been a good player. Don't get me wrong. He's been a good player. But Donato's also much younger than Nyquist, too. I think that's something that people certainly need to be kept in mind. Oh, Skook says the trade is not official yet. Okay, good. I was like, wow, I'm really under a rock today. If that's the case, I usually am up to date on my trades. But that was the rumored return. I mean, that would still be a great rumored return. And then Brian with a one here. He says, how about Tyler Boucher? I don't know how to pronounce that name. And a 2 and a 4. I don't know much about Tyler Boucher. I'm assuming he's a top pick. I'm awful at NHL prospects. I should be a lot better, but I'm not good at keeping up with them. A trade like that for Donato, like a prospect and like 2 mid picks, I would love. I think that's the right value that I would want if I'm Kyle Davidson, because you get a guy that you already know something about, and then you get 2 what if chips that can either be turned into other players in a form of a trade, or you draft guys and you keep refilling your cupboard, with those shots at the dartboard to, try and find a player for your future as a franchise. So I think there's a lot coming up here. It's going to be really, really, really exciting. And Stuart with a good one here says, trade this year's draft picks to Ottawa. I'm in. Go get Brady Tkachuk. I'm still on that bandwagon, even though I know they're not going to trade him because he's really, really good. He's their captain, and I don't blame them either. Trade deadline watch. Steve, we've got a list of players here. I'm going to run through it. This is pretty much the same list that we were operating with last week. Not a lot has changed on that front. I guess you could maybe add like an Andreas Athanasiou to this list as well, including a Peter Mrazek, who we've already added to our list. But I just want to kind of go one by one here and get your thoughts. Are they going to be moved? And if so, what do you expect the return to be? We already talked about Donato, so I think we can put that one to bed of kind of what the value is we're looking for there. Does Pat, I'm going to bucket these two together. Do Pat Maroon or Craig Smith get moved, in your opinion?
I could see them. They provide value to a Stanley Cup contender in the fact that, like, Pat Maroon, he's got 3 rings. He's got that experience, and that means something to teams. I can see him getting moved. Same thing with Craig Smith. But as far as a return, that's going to probably be like a late round draft pick. Nothing crazy. If they get moved at all, they got to get interest first.
Definitely. In my opinion, just based on the play that we've seen from both of them throughout the course of the season, I would probably put my money on Smith getting traded before Maroon.
Yeah.
I just think that he's still shown that he's got some wheels. It's hard to call them wheels because it looks like he's dragging a sack of potatoes behind him when he skates sometimes. But I think that's, I think just because of his offensive production that he's actually ended up having.
Yeah.
I think I agree with you there. I think he probably garners more attention. But even if it's like a 5th or a 6th round pick, I mean, again, a lot of it comes down to this. And Brian asks here in the comments, he says, what about an Alec Martinez trade? There was reports weeks ago now from Scott Powers, who, again, is probably one of the most connected insiders about the Blackhawks. He said that the expectation is that Alec Martinez is not going to be traded. And the reason for that being Kyle Davidson, and I guess just how they've typically done it with veterans, if they're going to move guys, they approach them and say, would you like to go to a contender? If the veteran says yes, they'll trade them at the deadline. If the veteran says, I kind of just want to stay put, I don't want to uproot my family, I'm cool staying here through the rest of the season, then they'll stay. I think that's what happened with Alec Martinez. So the rumor is that he is going to stay. I would be absolutely appalled if that has changed. I think he's going to stay. I think he kind of enjoys working with a lot of these young guys, and now he's going to play even more because Seth Jones isn't here. So, he's still going to get a ton of ice time as well down the stretch here. Tim says it even here. He says, I don't think Martinez gets moved. I can almost assure people that's probably not going to happen. Based on the reports, that's probably not going to happen. But, Maroon and Smith are both like, yeah, we'll go to a cup contender if somebody wants us. Then they'll absolutely get traded. And I think at that point, then Davidson's not worried about the return. He's like, well, fuck, if it's a 5th or a 6th, so be it. If nothing else, it's a shot in the dark in the draft on a guy late that maybe provides you some value, right? Isaac Phillips, who, had some really good looks and is still young and could turn into a decent NHL player. He played a lot of games for the Blackhawks. He was a 5th round pick, right? So It's okay to have those shots in the dark late in a draft. Those are the type of guys that you need, even if they're organizational depth, you still need that. And if you can get it organically through the draft, that's even better. Next name, Peter Mrazek. Do you think they pull off a miracle and move him, or the Hawks carrying 3 goaltenders for the rest of the season?
You would like to think they try to move him. The issue is I don't think a lot of teams are going to bite on Mrazek because he's just not looked the same since his groin injury, and that's something that kind of plagued him before he came to the Blackhawks. And right now he's kind of looking similar to when I think he was with the Maple Leafs. He was dealing with that injury. He's looking similar to his playing with the Leafs, and it wasn't very good. It sucks because last season Mrazek had a fantastic season, and that would have been the year to trade him. So if you are going to move him, it's going to be the sake of just freeing up a spot just for 2 goaltenders. And if they do keep 3 goaltenders, that's not something Kyle Davidson is not going to be okay with. In Scott Power's article, he was quoted as saying, it's something we'll have to navigate and figure out how we want to move forward. If we have to move forward with the current group, we will and can kick that can down the road to the off season. So it looks like if they don't get any buyers or anybody wanting Mrazek, they're going to be okay with carrying 3 goaltenders and then deal with him in the off season.
Okay. And that's important information to know, because the offseason makes it a lot easier, right? Because teams have more cap flexibility. You can go over the cap during the offseason a little bit, and then as long as you're compliant by the start of the season, you're fine. That's the time, right? Where if they're going to move Bressois potentially to somebody else, and Bressois at a reasonable number, a little over $3 million a year, there's going to be somebody that might be interested, even if it's for a low-level draft pick. Brian insinuating a potential future considerations or a 7th if he gets traded. I could see that being a case just to give him a fresh chance and somewhere else. And again, it's also clearing valuable playing time for guys like Soderblom and Knight as well. Because it'd be really interesting to see if they actively rotate all 3 goalies the rest of the season. Mrazek here for a game, then they scratch somebody else, and it's Soderblom for this game, and it's Knight's his backup, and then you scratch the other. That would be kind of wild to experience throughout the rest of the year. But certainly, I agree with you. There's a lot more ease in moving guys in the offseason. Tim said, wasn't Crevier a 7th round pick? Yes, he was. So it just goes to show, right? You can find value on guys late in the draft. Maybe they're never going to be superstars, but organizational depth is just as important as the superstars, right? It's a different level of importance, granted, but you still need those guys to win just as much as you need your star players to win as well. So that can certainly be good. Also, just kind of a note for all of our program listeners today, because we've been talking about this Nyquist thing. That trade has happened. According to the report here, the Wild have acquired Nyquist from the Predators in exchange for a 2026 second-round pick. Worth noting, a lot of 26 picks are being traded, not 25 picks. A lot of teams I don't think love this draft class. So I think if we're going to see trades this year, it's going to be a lot of 26 and 27 picks being moved rather than 25 picks. With that being said, Nashville is also retaining 50% of Nyquist's salary for the rest of the season. So that makes it very, very easy for the Wild to fit him under their cap circumstances. So worth noting for everybody that was in the comments talking about the Nyquist trade. It has happened. So that'll be something to see. Brian asks, what about sending Mrazek down to the AHL to help the Ice Hogs as a veteran to help Drew Commesso? Certainly possible. It doesn't do anything for cap relief, granted. You only get $1 million of cap relief because it's the most you can bury a contract in the AHL. The only downside with stuff like that, trying to explain this without, I don't want to say I'm going to sound like an asshole. At least I don't think I'm going to sound like an asshole. I think it's really easy for us as fans. I do it too. So I will put my hand up and say I am the biggest critic of this. It's really easy to say, well, yeah, just send them to the AHL or send them here or fire them into the sun, right? It's really easy for us to have that commentary. But these are still people. Peter Mrazek has played 10 plus seasons in the NHL. You really think he's going to want to report to Rockford? If anything, I would argue that you would see something happen where the Hawks would essentially terminate his contract and let him sign somewhere else at that point versus sending him to Rockford. Unless he's all for it and wants to be Drew Comesso's, mentor, then that's one thing. Because then he still gets paid at least, right? Hey, you're still making your $4.25. You're just playing down in Rockford, helping a young kid. But if he's got his pride, Brandon Saad had his pride. Brandon Saad forfeited $4.5 million next year to actually stay in the NHL and go play with the Vegas Golden Knights. So keep in mind, these guys are, they're humans, right? They have pride. They have ego. They've worked hard to stay in the NHL. Like, they're not just going to absolutely accept an outright to the AHL because he's on a one-way contract. He doesn't have to report. It's not like a two-way deal where, guys are always shuttling back and forth when they're on two-way deals. So I think that's something to keep in mind here. Tim said something similar. He doubts he would go there. He thinks they would terminate the contract. I totally agree. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind here when it's all said and done. Steve, I got another name for you.
Oh, boy.
Is there a Lukas Reichel trade at this deadline coming up? We saw him return to the lineup. He had a nice night, too. I believe he had a goal and an assist. Had a really strong game against Anaheim. He's had the most up and down roller coaster of a season for a variety of different reasons. Is it time to give him a fresh change of scenery if a team comes to you with the right price? Or do you hang on to him for the last season of that $1.2 million a year contract that he signed in the summer?
I think in our last episode, I was pretty much of the opinion that Reichel was most likely not going to get moved by the deadline. And if they were going to do a trade, they would probably do it next year. However, that's kind of changed. And the reason why is just because he's a young player. And I mean, I didn't think Jones was going to get traded. And look at what happened yesterday. And it ended up in the Blackhawks' favor. So it very well could happen. And, Kyle Davidson, he's not tied to the Bowman era draft picks, which Reichel is. So like he could move on from him, and why not? Reichel, he's got a lot of potential still, and he's a young player. And for Reichel, like, ideally, like if he were to pan out, you'd like to see him on like a second line somewhere. I don't see that happening, to be honest. And on like the bottom six, I don't think that's the best spot for him. Davidson already has a lot of forwards who could become potential bottom six players that might end up being better suited for that role than Lukas Reichel. So for Lukas Reichel, it's probably in his best interest to go to a different team, new scenery, and he'll probably kick ass wherever he goes. It's just I don't think he'll be kicking ass here. So to answer the question, I am starting to lean towards it. It could be possible he gets traded this week.
That's an interesting thought. Stuart with a couple of comments here that are all along the lines of what we're talking about. He said, buy Mrazek out at this point. It's possible, but then you got to eat money on that. And then he says Reichel for Zegras. I think that's an interesting proposal. I know there's a lot of rumors of Zegras moving on from Anaheim. It would probably have to be more besides just Reichel to get a guy like Trevor Zegras, but maybe that's a starting point, right? Like Reichel's the focal point of a trade. Maybe you use one of those first round picks or another high draft pick to factor in with him as well. But a really intriguing possibility here from Skokes said, what about a Donato / Mrazek or Reichel / Mrazek package? And would that make it more enticing to trade a guy like Peter Mrazek? I think that's a very, very well a possibility. I think the only downside of that is the Hawks are probably then limiting what they would get in return for probably more Donato than Reichel. But a Reichel Mrazek move, maybe attached with a draft pick, maybe it's like a 2 or a 3 in a future year to maybe get a prospect and a player or something like that, I think would be something very interesting to see if that's the case. Because sometimes you nailed it perfectly, Steve. Sometimes guys just need a new change of scenery. We see it in the NHL all the time. I think more maybe than any other sport, I feel like it's the NHL where we see that, where maybe a young player just doesn't get a fair shake in a certain city or a certain team, and things just aren't going right, and like they don't mesh well with the coach or something like that, and then they go somewhere else and they succeed. And it's just, sometimes you need the right situation in order to be the player that you're meant to be at the NHL level. I think Reichel's starting to absolutely get into that territory, right? We saw it with eventually kind of Kirby Dach, even though he's just been unable to stay healthy. He just had another severe injury that's going to keep him out for an extended period of time. But, we've seen it with other names from the Blackhawks, right? Dylan Strome, look at him. Took him a long time, but he got to Washington and now he's found his home and he's become the player that people expected him to be. Just took him a little bit longer. Reichel might just be the same way. And it might just take, going to a new city and being in a new spot in order to do that. So I do think it'll be interesting to see. Kevin says this. He says, Reichel, what does he do? Hits nobody, doesn't drive the net, let him go. It'll be interesting. Again, I that to me is the name that's the most fascinating now that Jones has been moved already. It's, does Lucas Reichel stay or does Lucas Reichel go? And if he does go, what does he go for? So I know that's something I will be looking at. And I'm sure that's something that we as a team will be looking at here. And then the last part, will they add a veteran? I think they will. I don't know who. This is the part where I enjoy the sense of the unknown of like, who are they going to get? What weird rumors are going to come out from Elliot Friedman and all the insiders in the NHL? What Franken spaghetti and meatballs, bomb are we going to get on Twitter in the next couple of days about maybe a Blackhawks trade? Because now that Saravelli's appearing on CHSN every once in a while, I think he's got a little bit more in with the Blackhawks organization. So he gets a lot of the rumors, it feels like, first. He was the first one to report the full trade in the Seth Jones deal. I think that's very important context. Friedman was on it as well, but Saravelli had all the details. He knew what pick was what's the clause changes, and I think a lot of that is because of that connection now with CHSN. So keep an eye on Frank Saravelli because he might be on top of some stuff in the coming time. No CHSN updates. Speaking of that devil, Steve, what do you say? We get into ruffling some feathers. Do you have a ruffle feathers topic for us here before we get out of here?
I was trying to think of one for this past week, and right now I honestly I don't got anything.
That's fair.
I know you got something.
Fair. I do. I'm ready to ruffle some feathers. I always love ruffling feathers. I think this is the part of the show I look forward to the most because I just hope that when I say this, I get some response on Twitter from somebody that's like actually pissed off at what I have to say, so I can get into not like an argument. I don't want to argue with people. I like debating people though. And I'm always one that's like willing to listen to the other side. So if you ever want to debate me on Twitter, go ahead and send one at me. But my ruffle some feathers is always listen to GM Ron. And the reason I say that is I have been on this one's also directed at Tony a little bit too. He'll enjoy this when he listens back to our episode today. The Blackhawks fan base, and Tony included, have been very good about panicking after every single game. Where are they going to go? How is this going to get better? Nobody knows how to trust the process. It's a long season. Hockey is a long season. And I have been on these airwaves telling people they have the money. There's opportunity here in terms of who's falling off the books and what spots are going to be open on the team. We're starting to see Frank Nazar take that step forward like everybody was worried about. Yes, Bedard's been a little cold recently, but last show we talked about that 23 points in 22 game stretch he had there. He was consistently producing. Everything's going to be just fine. And I think people are starting to see that the grass is greener on the other side now that Jones's contract's off the books and that whole storyline has been largely evaporated from the team. In addition to that, right, they get a huge trade piece in Spencer-Knight and another first that they can use to improve this team. Listen to GM Ron. Have patience. Trust the process. Because just like Tim says here in the comments, hashtag and Kyle we trust, Kyle from Chicago. Damn right. Kyle Davidson knows a thing or two. He's been around the NHL long enough in the front office. I think a lot of people forget he's been in that front office for the Blackhawks since 2013. Just because he wasn't the GM doesn't mean he wasn't actively involved in everything that was happening year in and year out. He knows what he's doing. Give the guy some time. Rebuilds don't happen overnight, especially when you had to burn it down to the ground like they did with the Blackhawks because there was nothing in the depth pool because Stan Bowman couldn't draft worth shit, frankly, in his time here or develop talent for that matter. But we've seen what Wyatt Kaiser did when he went down and came back and looked great in his first game back from Rockford. They're doing something good down in Rockford. Mark Eaton is a huge piece of this puzzle too, and what they've been able to do in terms of developing defensemen. Levshinov has been really good recently down in Rockford, especially from an offensive standpoint. GM Ron says to be patient and to breathe and just trust the process. Things are going to be okay. And I think this trade helped a lot of people kind of see that a little bit of like, oh, they can do things to still improve the team while, moving on from a guy who is a really good player. Like Seth Jones is still a really good player. But you got something in terms of a need, right? You solidify your goaltending option for the foreseeable future. You get another one. It's all going to be okay. It's okay to listen to GM Ron. Things are going to be good. We just got to have patience and trust the process and trust Kyle. I think it's going to go just fine. Stick taps. You got a stick tap to give out.
I do. This one actually might ruffle some feathers, so two for one.
Two for
I'm gonna give my
one.
stick taps to Seth Jones. I had some criticism about the stuff he said and how he brought it up, but had he not been as vocal as he was to the media, I don't think this trade happened. So, and like, just to be clear, I'm not trying to sound like a terrible person and be like, like, get him out of the Blackhawks. Like he's a good defenseman, and like I really do think like Jones for his career needed to go to a winning team. And the contract wasn't good for the Blackhawks, and now that's not a problem. Seth Jones, you can go compete for a Stanley Cup. That's awesome, and I do mean that. So, stick taps. You brought the issue out to the public, and look where that got you.
Well put. Honestly, I love that, and I'm in complete agreement with you. I am still a very big fan of Seth Jones. I know I'm probably in the minority. I realize that. I've been probably the most vocal on this show about defending Seth Jones in the past. It was an unfortunate circumstance, right? Everybody's, he makes too much money. He didn't negotiate his own contract. Bowman was willing to give him that because Bowman also sold him on that they were going to be competing. And they weren't because he was lying because he's a big liar. Thank God he's not in Chicago anymore. I fucking hate that guy. Anyway, I agree. Stick taps to Seth Jones. He was vocal about how he felt, and I think it was for the best of both sides. And at the end of the day, that's okay. He's going to go. He's going to compete. Things you love to see. I completely agree. Well said, Steve. My stick tap goes to the GM that pulled off that trade, Mr. Kyle Davidson. Stick taps from me because, again, I think he continues to do good work. He's putting pieces in place, right? Like GMs can't have foresight of like, this is exactly how this is going to go. We never know how any player is going to work in any situation at any given time. These guys are human. Things happen. Injuries happen. Guys just don't fit sometimes. But to be able to kind of step back and be the GM that he has and move the pieces around and bring in the youth that he has, and we've seen Frank Nazar start growing into a really good player. And, I think Connor Bedard's going to start to feel some relief now because they're going to start bringing in other pieces to work around him to help him be the best version of himself. We've seen Teuvo Teravainen been incredible this season, quietly been incredible. He's been awesome. And that was a Kyle Davidson signing, talking him into coming back, leveraging that relationship he had with Teuvo as a young player to bring him back into the fold and make him want to be a part of this. Everybody was like, it's great that he brought in pieces, but like he didn't fix the team. You can't fix the team in one offseason, not to where they had to burn it down to. But he's taken steps year after year to improve this club. The Seth Jones departure is essentially the last snuff of the Bowman era that's here. Now this is Kyle Davidson's team. It's his franchise, for sure. Every piece of this puzzle is his doing now. Now we get to finally see what is going to happen. Because like Stolitz says here in the comments, KD will use that first-round pick to get Bedard more help. I fully believe that. He's going to trade, though. Like, I think that Toronto pick this year could be just as easily flipped in a trade as well. I don't think the Blackhawks are married to the idea of 2 first-round picks this year. I think they're very fine with their top of the draft pick. They've still got plenty of other draft picks in this draft. In addition to that, you got a couple of 2s next year in the 2026 draft, in addition to your own. I think they have 3 in total. Like, they've got still a lot of good draft capital for the next few seasons. They absolutely can utilize those 2 extra firsts that they have now to get guys who are already here and all ready to make a difference on the roster. So stick taps to Kyle Davidson in not only what he's done, but what I believe he's going to do as well, especially with the trade deadline on the horizon this coming Friday. Steve, before we get out of here, we are going to look ahead to the upcoming games and as well a little bit of disclosure here about what's to come with the trade deadline. So for starters, 4 games in this calendar week. It's a busy week for the Blackhawks, but 3 of them are at the United Center. They do play on Monday night against the Los Angeles Kings. It's a 7:30 start over on CHSN. I will probably be in attendance for that game. I do have tickets. I'm hoping Tony Marchese will be as well, and maybe him and I can do a little bit of discussion about the Spencer-Knight trade in addition. Then they're back home again on Wednesday. It's the Ottawa Senators coming to town. That's also a 7:30 game on CHSN. And then Friday, the Blackhawks host the Utah Hockey Club for the first time at the United Center. That will also be a 7:30 start time on CHSN. And then they will head quickly down to Nashville, that quick hour flight down to Nashville. They will take on the Predators in Nashville at 7 o'clock Central Time on CHSN on Saturday night. And that will round out the week. Steve, I'm going to put you on the spot again. 4 games. Seth Jones' distractions out the door. They played some decent hockey. What's their record going to be through these 4?
I'm going to go with 2-1-1.
Woo-hoo!
I think they're
Nice.
going to take the Kings to overtime tomorrow. They're going to come off their win in Anaheim, take them to overtime, and probably lose it. I think they're going to lose against Ottawa, and then they're going to kind of get pissed off and try to get a game back from Utah when Utah comes here. And then Nashville, they suck, and I think the Blackhawks, they can absolutely and they should beat Nashville. So 2-1-1 is what I'm going with.
Hell yeah, brother. That gets me excited. I hope they go 2-1-1. I couldn't tell you the last time they had a winning week of hockey this season, let alone and just in general. I don't know if I can be as optimistic. I actually think I'm going to stick with what I had last week with more confidence this week, and that's 1-2-1. I agree with you. I think they go. I think they go to overtime with LA, but LA is a good team, and I think LA is going to just get the better of them. They're going to feel rejuvenated. I really hope Spencer-Knight starts. I don't know if he's going to be with the team in time, but I hope he is. And if that's the case and he gets the net, I'm going to be astounded to see his first game as a Blackhawk. But I do think they go to OT. I think Ottawa, they lose because Ottawa's good. I think a lot of people forget the Senators are in a playoff spot right now. Like, they're having a really good year. That young core is finally starting to come together and play like people hope they would. And then I think they lose to Utah. I still think Utah is just the better team right now. They're a young, up-and-coming team. Genther, Keller, they're all really good. But I absolutely think they beat Nashville. And I think that's going to be the saving grace as they go to their building and beat them in their own building. And I think that's going to make everybody really, really happy to end the week, despite some shaky losses, we'll call it, in between there at the United Center. But we'll see. We'll have to wait and see. But hey, if you score your first predictions point with a 2-1-1, we're gonna be throwing up high fives all around the Four Feathers chat, talking about how great of a week of hockey it was, watching them win 2 games out of 4. Steve, I have 2 questions for you, and they actually come from our comment section. Well, actually, it's really just one, so I'm gonna hit you with it anyway. Do you think Anders Sorensen goes back to Rockford after the season, or does he move on from the organization?
Oh, yeah, Tim. I do think that Sorensen's going to go back to Rockford only because Mark Eaton, the assistant GM, he's down there as a head coach right now. I think they didn't hire a head coach for Rockford just because they expect Sorensen to go back down there in case he wasn't the guy. And I think Sorensen is making a very strong case for him that he is not going to be the Blackhawks head coach.
I agree on that final part of your statement there. That's a really good point that I didn't even think about, is like, yeah, they thrust Mark Eaton from a front office role down onto the bench just to keep it warm. Sorensen's been around the organization for a while. I think a lot of people forget that. I think he actually was here during the Jeremy Colleton era, dare I say, if I remember correctly. So he's survived through a few head coaches. I think they really like what he does. I think they like what he does as a developmental coach. And I think we've seen a little bit of that at the NHL, right? We've seen Frank Nazar kind of have that hotter streak now in the new year. And, we've seen Bedard have a really good, streak offensively under Sorensen because he's opened up the game a little more. We've seen some of these defensemen show flashes. Like, I do think he's a good developmental coach. It's okay to be a great developmental coach and not a great head coach in the NHL. Like, they don't have to be the same. I agree with you. I think that makes total sense. As long as he feels it's right to go back to Rockford and stay a part of the organization, I'm sure that there's some that they've discussed with him when he took over, of like, hey, we're going to give you a shot. And like, if you blow our expectations away, we'll give you the NHL job. But worst case scenario, we do still want to keep you around and put you back in Rockford next year if you'll want to come back. I think that's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. But I do think that's really interesting to see from there. So it says it depends on if KD goes all in during the offseason. If he does, Anders is back in Rockford. I think Anders is back in Rockford if he stays with the organization regardless. I just wonder if there's any of like that, well, you just gave me a head coaching opportunity and it didn't work and I don't want to stick around. Like that could happen, but I think your reasoning with Eaton's position and what he's been doing makes a lot of sense where Anders just slides back into the AHL next year and, they bring in the hopeful, coach for the foreseeable future. I really want David Carl, but I don't think he's going to leave Denver, but that's neither here nor there. That's the guy I want. I know everybody's like Mike Sullivan. I'm like, no. Get me Carl. I don't want Mike Sullivan.
I want Carl.
I want Carl too. I got a buddy who's a Penguins fan and has talked mad shit about Sullivan for years. So I'm not totally sure if I'm as high on Sullivan as most Hawks fans are. But that's because I have somebody who watches those games religiously, telling me on my shoulder that he's not the guy. So I want to see Carl come from Denver. That would be cool, but we'll have to wait and see. Steve, this was an awesome show. This was a long show, so we appreciate everybody that stuck with us in the comment section, has watched along. It was fun. And this is probably the last time we're on the microphone before the trade deadline. I'm going to say probably because if something really big and weird happens, I'm sure we're going to find a way to get on the mic between now and Friday. But be on the lookout because Friday, myself and Mr. Tony Marchese will be together in person during the whole last final day of the trade deadline, writing articles, hopefully recording some fun video content. I think there's a really good possibility that Safari Ron, if you know, will make his return to the Four Feathers podcast X posts and Instagram pages as a part of some of that content. But it should be really, really fun. Very excited for it. Hopefully the Blackhawks do make some kind of a big move. And certainly Steve will be in your ear over the course of the week as well to get you involved in some of that content too. So should be great. This is a fun week for Blackhawks fans, I think. And then obviously once March 7th comes and goes, we can all settle back, know what the team looks like down the stretch, and just enjoy really the final month of Blackhawks hockey before it's all over. And then we start whining about wanting hockey back until September when preseason hockey returns to the city of Chicago. Steve, I appreciate you joining me. Good, sir. This was a fun show. There is a new night at the Roundtable. Spencer-Knight is a Chicago Blackhawks. Seth Jones is in Florida, and it's trade deadline week. So a lot of shit can happen between now and Friday, March 7th, and we will have it all for you here at the Four Feathers Podcast and on tapsportsnet.com. Steve, what do you say? We got out of here with a good old let's go Hawks?
Let's go Hawks.
Let's go Hawks, baby.